I'm Caleb Bissinger, and this is The Next Big Idea. Today, Sebastian Junger almost died a few years ago. What did the experience teach him? What can it teach you? Nine o'clock, a June night 4 years ago. The last traces of daylight glint in the western sky, and Sebastian Junger, the best-selling author of The Perfect Storm and co-director of the Oscar-nominated documentary Restrepo, lies on an operating table. He is dying.
The doctor asked permission to put a large gauge needle through my neck into my jugular to transfuse me, and it didn't sound very pleasant. I said, "You mean in case there's an emergency?" And he said, "This is the emergency right now."
What Sebastian didn't know, what the doctors didn't yet know, was that an undiagnosed aneurysm in his pancreatic artery had ruptured. It was now geysering blood into his abdomen. He was losing a pint of blood roughly every 10 minutes. And there are only 12 pints of blood in the human body. Sebastian, as he puts it, was a human hourglass. As the doctor raced to transfuse him,
I became aware of this black pit that opened up underneath me, and it was pulling me into it. And I kind of knew, in the sort of animal knowledge, that if you go into the infinitely black pit, you're not coming out. So I said to the doctor, who's still fumbling around on my neck, I said, "Doc, you got to hurry. You're losing me right now. I'm going."
That's the last thing he remembers for a very long time. Sebastian survived his brush with death, though brush doesn't really do it justice. He lost 2/3 of the blood in his body. He came close enough to death that he could smell its rank and foul odor. It was like a slavering beast, he writes, breathing over his shoulder. Back home, back among the living, Sebastian didn't feel like he had a new lease on life. He felt like he'd bought a lemon. He was mired in an existential funk. He questioned his own existence. Was he real? He was haunted by something that had happened to him as he lay dying. He'd seen something besides the black pit, something both freaky and consoling, something that it turns out a lot of people see when they're close to death. And that vision, that experience, that phenomenon, which we talk about at length in our conversation, inspired him to train his journalistic skills on an outlandish question. Is there any scientific evidence of an afterlife? The story of Sebastian's near-death experience and his quest for answers in its wake is the subject of his new book, In My Time of Dying, How I Came Face to Face with the Idea of an Afterlife. It's a beautiful, nerve-wracking, sometimes overwhelming book that manages, in fewer than 150 pages, to not only take readers into the hospital where doctors miraculously saved Sebastian's life, but also on a whirlwind tour of, wait for it, quantum physics. I'm a longtime admirer of Sebastian's work, but this book, and the conversation you're about to hear, exceeded my already high expectations. It changed the way I think about what it means to be alive. It helped me finally understand what the hell people mean when they talk about Schrodinger's cat and the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. Most of all, it left me feeling humble about my own impermanence, and humble too about how much we still don't understand about the nature of reality. Sebastian Junger, welcome to The Next Big Idea.
Thank you.
We're going to talk a lot about your close encounter with death and what you learned from that experience. But I want to first talk a little bit about your life before that day in June 2020. You say in your new book that everyone has a relationship with death. What was your relationship with death prior to that near-death experience?
Well, it's complicated. I did a lot of dangerous things.
Mm-hmm.
I was a high climber for tree companies. I worked 100 feet in the air, hanging on a rope with a chainsaw, taking trees down in sections. And then from there, I went on to being a war reporter. So you'd think that I was sort of like at ease with risk. And actually, there's another counterintuitive psychological theory that people that intentionally take risks are actually exceptionally anxious people and are trying to reassure themselves that actually that they have agency and that they can sort of navigate this risky world and come back safe, and that reassures them that they have some modicum of control. I think I fell into that category. And so it requires an enormous amount of denial if you're actually quite an anxious person, which I am, and you go into risky situations. It takes a huge amount of denial to make it bearable. And I'm extremely good at denial. Like I can just create firewalls inside me that keep emotions from sloshing around where I don't want them. And that's exactly what I did with anxiety and risk and fear.
Can I tell you a strange story?
Yeah.
When I was in my 20s, I wanted to be a journalist. And I happened to meet with an esteemed editor at a major magazine. And he looks at me and he goes, "Caleb, if you could be any journalist in the world, who would it be?" And without missing a beat, I said, "Sebastian Junger." And it was because I was just so enamored of your prose style. I mean, The Perfect Storm had meant so much to me. I probably read The Last Whale Hunter a dozen times. So I said, "Sebastian Junger," and he gives me this kind of weird look. And he goes, "Really? Do you have a death wish?"
Oh, my God.
And so that was a little bit of your reputation. How does that make you feel that you were sort of known as this person who had a quote unquote death wish?
Well, it's silly because in the world that I was working in, the world of journalism and foreign reporters and foreign correspondents and people who were stationed in Baghdad for years at a time, I was very much at the low end of risk taking, right? I mean, I'm nothing. You know, I did occasional 2 or 3 week assignments for magazines. There were people that were living it 24/7 for months, years at a time,
Right.
taking extraordinary risks. So the reason I'm well known for that is because a lot of those people doing this sort of real trench work of journalism in these really, really tough and dangerous situations, a lot of those people don't write books and they don't write best-selling books. And so I became known to the public.
Mm-hmm.
I became emblematic of a risk-taking industry because I was a best-selling author. But there's scores, hundreds of sort of quote nameless journalists who aren't writing books. The public doesn't really know who they are unless they pay attention to bylines in newspapers.
Let's get to the heart of your new book. September 2019, you feel a sort of sudden, surprising, mysterious pain in your abdomen. Describe that for us. What was surprising about it? What did you make of it?
Yeah, so I was an athlete when I was young. I ran marathons. I was a good track and cross-country runner. I remained athletic my entire life. So I just as background, it never occurred to me that I could have an urgent health problem that would require me to rush to the emergency room to save my life. I'm not heart attack territory, right? Like that's not going to, and, athletes and I think often men in general, they sort of get by ignoring things. If you can ignore pain, you can do a whole lot more in life than if you don't ignore pain. And that was a lesson I learned early on, and it kind of worked. And so when I started having this sort of like weird searing pain in my abdomen, my first instinct was like, well, it's bearable. Like I didn't collapse on the floor, and let's just see what happens. I'm good. And so it would sort of come and go. And what I didn't know was that I had a very rare, very serious structural problem in my abdomen. It wasn't a function of my level of health or fitness. It was a totally structural abnormality.
Right.
And it was reaching a critical point that could have and probably was very likely to kill me.
And so there was no part of you in those months that thought, I should probably go get this checked out.
No, there wasn't. And that's my denial kicking in, right? And, I was like, oh, maybe it's cancer, the word everyone's scared of. And so part of me was like, just sort of didn't want to know. And I know that just sounds absurd, but people are absurd, right? Whatever.
Yeah.
And I had a 3-year-old and a newborn. So I was extremely busy. So part of it was just, I was too busy to sort of notice what was going on, but the pain would They would force me to sit down for a while. It would last about half an hour and then would let up. And so, that's a tip off. Like if the pain's so bad you can't function for a while, just go to the doctor, right?
Right. So tell me about June 16th, 2020. This is the day your aneurysm burst. I mean, did it start just like any other day?
Yeah. So June 16, 2020, we are living in an old house in a very remote place. It's the end of a dead-end dirt road inside a huge preserve of federal land. It's so remote that there's no cell service. The phone lines are ancient, so if it rains, the phone lines don't work for a few days. They short out. And it's a 1-hour transport to the nearest hospital. And so it was a beautiful summer day. It was during COVID, and my family and I were in this beautiful place. And we, by some miracle, had a few hours of babysitting that afternoon. We were friends with the family down the road that had a couple of teenage daughters that loved our daughters. And so they came over for a few blessed hours, which happened very rarely, just like give us a break. So my wife and I went off to a little cabin that's on the property that's even deeper in the woods, right? And there's no electricity in the cabin. There's no running water. It's really, the wood stove is really rustic, right? So we were out there, and in mid-sentence, I felt this bolt of pain shoot through my abdomen. I was like, oh, what was that? And it really filled my whole abdomen. The pain filled my whole abdomen.
So worse than any of the pain you had experienced up until that point?
Well, it was more persistent. I mean, I've had kidney stones. It wasn't anything close to that kind of pain. But it was a lot worse than sort of indigestion, right? It was just somewhere in the middle where I was like, I couldn't think about anything else, but I wasn't screaming, right? So I twisted and turned and tried to work it out. And I finally got up to see if I walked around, if that would work it out. I just assumed it was a sort of really intense digestive problem. And I got up and I almost fell over. And I sat back down and I said, I've never felt anything like this. I think I'm going to need help. And of course, my wife knows that I'm quite the stoic. So she knew that if I said I'm going to need help, I was probably in real danger.
Right.
I got my arm around her shoulders and her arm around my waist, and she sort of half dragged. I couldn't walk, right? I mean, I was too lightheaded to support my own weight. And she sort of half dragged, half stumbled, out of the cabin and down the trail, and finally got to the dirt driveway. And she put me in the passenger seat of the car and ran in and told the babysitters what was happening. And one of them came out and managed to hook 1 bar of cell service on her cell phone by walking around the driveway, looking for a signal. And she finally got 1 bar of service and called 911. And, by then I was going blind. And so what was happening was that I'd had an undiagnosed aneurysm in my pancreatic artery, one of your 5 pancreatic arteries. And an aneurysm is a sort of ballooning of the blood vessel because there's a weak spot, there's some anatomical problem, and it's not high cholesterol, it's not, whatever, a product of
it's not a lifestyle.
Health. It's not lifestyle, right? And which is what makes it so dangerous in a way, because if the doctor looks at me like, oh, you're a picture of health, you're good, don't worry about it. But I had this weak spot in one artery, and it's very rare, and they're really deadly, because if they burst, the blood flow flowing through a small artery is now dumping directly into your abdominal cavity. It's as if you'd been stabbed and that artery had been severed by the knife, except instead of bleeding out a wound, of course, the wound shows the doctors where to stick their finger, as it were, like where to plug the leak. You're bleeding into your own abdominal cavity, and your abdomen's basically a big bowl of spaghetti. I mean, the doctors, if you're bleeding in there, the doctors really don't know where it is. It's very hard to determine that. So they loaded me in the ambulance, and by then I'd gone into compensatory shock. Your body sort of, if it's bleeding, it sort of clamps down on everything that it doesn't need, your intestines and your arms and your legs and all this stuff, and pools blood in your chest and your brain. I was in and out of consciousness, but my clarity came back and I felt better, except for the pain in my abdomen. I felt better.
Yeah.
So the whole ambulance ride, I was like, I don't need to go to the hospital. It's just belly pain. It's blah, blah, blah. As soon as we hit the ER, I went off a cliff, and I went out of compensatory shock and into end stage hemorrhagic shock. I was convulsing. I was incredibly cold. I was incoherent. And the doctors knew immediately that it was almost certainly an abdominal hemorrhage. Had I gotten to the hospital quickly, my chance of survival would have been 30%, 30. It took me an hour and a half to get to the hospital, so my chances of survival were extremely low. And they all knew that. So they were looking at a sort of dead man walking, basically. And it was because of their medical brilliance that I survived.
Yeah, I think you say 10 to 20% your chances were probably at that time when you showed up. So you're in the ambulance and you're thinking, oh, this is nothing. This is a waste of time. You get to the hospital, you crash, you're in and out of consciousness, you're racked with pain. Can you pinpoint the moment where what's left of your conscious brain goes, holy shit, I'm dying?
Well, I never had that thought. What I thought was, and I have to just tell people right now, I'm a stone cold atheist, right? I've been an atheist my whole life. My father was an atheist. He was a physicist, extremely rational person. I imagine that I am extremely rational as well. So just as a preface for what's coming, so we're in the trauma bay, and I just am puzzled by why there's so much activity around me. It's just belly pain, like what's going on? I was really confused. Mm-hmm. And the doctor asked permission to put a large gauge needle through my neck into my jugular to transfuse me, and it didn't sound very pleasant. I said, you mean in case there's an emergency? And he said, this is the emergency right now. I mean, I had no clue, right? And so I said, yeah, of course. So he started working on my neck. And as he was doing that, I became aware of this black pit that opened up underneath me. And it was sort of infinitely black and infinitely large. It was nothing. It was everything and nothing. Like it was, and it was pulling me into it. It was sort of sucking in light and sucking in me. And I was headed into this pit. And I kind of knew in the sort of animal knowledge that if you go into the infinitely black pit, you're not coming out.
Yeah.
And I started to panic. And then above me, I saw my father, my dead father. And he was sort of hovering there. And his sort of energy was there. And it's hard to quite describe what I was seeing, but I was seeing some energy form of my father. And he was sort of radiating this sort of care and benevolence. He was like, it's okay. You don't have to fight it. You can come with me. I'll take care of you. I was horrified, right? Because I didn't know I was dying, right? I was horrified. I was like, go with you. You're dead. I'm not going anywhere with you. I'm alive. I'm staying here. Thank you very much, right? Like I didn't know what the stakes were, and I was confused and horrified by his presence. And so I said to the doctor, who's still fumbling around on my neck, I mean, it felt like he was fumbling around on my neck. I said, Doc, you got to hurry. You're losing me right now. I'm going. Then things get kind of patchy for a while, but basically the short version is that they took me into the IR, the interventional radiology suite, where they can look at you with sort of real-time X-ray video. So they can work on your insides without cutting you open and see what's going on in real time. And so they threaded a catheter into my groin, up my femoral artery, and around to these twists and turns of our crazy vasculature, and eventually got this flexible hose, eventually got it to the ruptured artery and embolized it, plugged it with a coil. That took 6 hours. And I was not sedated because my vital signs were so low. I mean, I needed 10 units of blood to survive. There's 12 units of blood in the human body. I needed 10 to make it. My blood pressure was 60/40 when I got to the ER. I was running on fumes.
Good Lord.
And so I was in and out of consciousness the whole time and in enormous pain because I had 2/3 of my blood was in my abdominal cavity. And when blood comes into contact with your organs, it's excruciatingly painful. And, I suffered that for like 6 hours. It was absolutely hellish.
You mentioned that, you're fading in and out, but in the book, you managed to go back and talk to the physicians who were treating you and look at the medical logs and sort of reconstruct in painstaking detail what was happening almost minute by minute. And I have to say, it reminded me of what is perhaps, one of the most famous sections in The Perfect Storm, where you write about and sort of imagine in great detail the death of these 6 men who died aboard a shipping vessel in the North Atlantic in 1991. And in that book, you write,
they are suspended, open-eyed and unconscious, in the flooded enclosures of the boat. The darkness is absolute, and the boat may already be on her way to the bottom. Their bodies, having imposed increasingly drastic measures to keep functioning, have finally started to shut down. The body could be likened to a crew that resorts to increasingly desperate measures to keep their vessel afloat. Eventually, the last wire has shorted out, The last bit of decking has settled under the water. Tyne, Pierre, Sullivan, Moran, Murphy, and Shatford are dead.
What was it like, having written painstakingly about the deaths of others, to then write about your own near death in that same way, with that same level of detail and vividness?
To start with, there was an element of sort of moral exoneration, right? So one of the problems and one of the emotional, the psychological difficulties, even traumas of war reporting, is that you are making your living, and even sometimes a good living, reporting on the tragedies and reporting on the deaths of others.
Mm-hmm.
And you're not killing people. You're not making things worse. You're an observer, and the world's tragedies need observers, right? So it's all good, except that you can get, or at least I got, this sort of sense of like moral accountability. Like, you spend your whole life watching, documenting, and being paid to observe from a bit of a remove the deaths of other people.
Yeah.
There's a kind of moral debt there. And for me, there was an enormous amount of guilt that came from that. But after years of doing that, I stopped war reporting after one of my best friends, Tim Hetherington, was killed in combat in Libya. And so I stopped war reporting after that. I didn't want to annihilate all the people that loved me like he had just annihilated everyone who loved him, including myself. Then eventually, my marriage fell apart. I remarried. I had a family. I started this very peaceful, beautiful life.
Yeah.
And it never occurred to me that you can leave the front lines and eventually the front lines will come to you. So what I decided to do in terms of writing about my own death, first of all, the moral exoneration comes from the fact of, me being able to say to myself, you know what? I was analytical and dispassionate about the circumstances around other people's death. I deserve no better and no worse treatment. I'll do that with my own near death. And then finally, there's a sort of inherent drama in it. And I thought of myself, the name of the boat in The Perfect Storm was the Andrea Gale. And The Perfect Storm is basically me documenting all of the things that sank that boat and killed those men, starting with the fishing industry and how storms work and how waves work and why boats roll over and how they flood, and then finally how people drown. And I thought, I'm the Andrea Gale now, right? I'll just document all the things that sank me, or almost sank me, and exactly what it felt like and what was going on in medical terms and physical terms. I'll just document it like I did with The Perfect Storm. And that seemed to be a very satisfying mental concept to organize the book around.
You got so close to death that you could smell its breath. And you say a few times in the book, you're kind of wrestling with this realization that biologically, you were meant to die at age 58 from a burst aneurysm. That the fates had measured out your thread, and that's when it was supposed to be cut. But by the grace of incredible modern medicine, you lived, right? To use a cliche, you cheated death. I sometimes get the sense reading the book that you feel a sense of ambivalence about that, or even a sense of guilt about that. Am I projecting onto you, or are those emotions real?
What I felt was like somehow the assassin's bullet had missed my head.
Uh-huh.
But then if there's someone out there trying to assassinate me, they're just going to keep trying to do that till they get me. And that the universe was sort of constructed around the idea that I, one of, 8 billion people, little old me, but that I was going to die on June 16, 2020. And that the universe's intent had been subverted.
Mm-hmm.
And by, there was no traffic, whatever, a lot of things could have killed me, had I gotten there.
In the middle of the night, even, like that's an interesting detail in the book, right? That great doctors don't want the night shift, right? If you'd showed up at 3 a.m, you probably wouldn't have had the great medical care you got.
Right. Or, doctors take vacations too. Suppose he'd been in Bermuda. Whatever. Then some guy, some doctor who's, didn't have 30 years experience, only had 3 years experience, doesn't know how to, they barely pulled this off, right? Like it was really touch and go. They thought they couldn't do it. I saw the doctors shrug. I saw them look at each other and like, well, we've done all we can. This isn't working. And I caught that look and it was horrifying.
Oh my God.
And the alternative is an emergency laparotomy where they open your abdomen up and try to find the bleed before you bleed out. It's a lot less fun than it sounds, right? So there was a lot of randomness that saved my life, and I just thought, okay, the universe, I was supposed to die and I didn't, and it's gonna come after me again.
After this ordeal, it seems like you were living kind of this half life, right? Where you didn't want to fly on planes. You didn't want to be too far from hospital care. You didn't want to travel to foreign countries. You didn't want to be in a traffic jam. That sounds like a brutally hard way to live.
Yeah. And, had I survived a heart attack, that would make sense. What the doctor says, like, this never happens twice. You only have one aneurysm. It ruptured. We took care of it. It's not like you're going to start sprouting more aneurysms, right? It made no sense, except I knew that if I'd been in an airplane or in a traffic jam or hiking in the woods or whatever, I would have died. As it was, I almost died. So I got very, almost kind of agoraphobic. But I also had this other more abstract, in some ways more devastating fear. 2 days prior to almost dying, I had an absolutely extraordinary dream. And, just again, I'm an atheist. Not only am I not a mystic, I'm actively anti-mystic, right? I mean, I want nothing to do with all that woo-woo stuff. I'm like, no, thank you, I'm fine, right? So just to preface what I'm about to say is that at dawn, 2 nights prior, I was woken up by a terrible, terrible nightmare. And the nightmare was this, that I had died. And I was a spirit, and I was hovering over my family, trying to signal to them, hey, I'm right here, I'm right here. And they couldn't hear me or see me, and they were sobbing in grief. And I was made to understand that I died. I couldn't go back. That's just how it was. And I'm on the way out. And I woke up in a panic, and we co-sleep as a family. And I woke up next to my eldest daughter and sort of gripped her like I've seen her grip her stuffies, right? Like, oh my God, like, you're here. I'm safe. And I just wrote it off as just a weird dream. And then 36 hours later, that's exactly what almost happened. I almost died. As I did research on NDEs, near-death experiences, I realized that the dream that I had was almost an exact replication of a classic NDE. People who die and are brought back to life and have strange memories like I did from the threshold. In probably a majority of cases, there is the spirit is kind of hovering over the family or over the doctors who are trying to save them, and they can't engage. So I started to get this strange fear. Maybe my dream wasn't a dream. Maybe it was my actual experience of dying. Maybe that's what dying actually feels like when it really happens, and that there is a spirit, and you do hover over your family, and that everything since then is a dying hallucination. So that instead of waking up from the nightmare, I actually hallucinated that I woke up from the nightmare, and then a couple of days went by, and I felt the pain in my abdomen, blah, 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 and then miraculously, the doctor saved me, and it's all a dying hallucination, and it's just my consciousness flickering out after I already died. And there's no way to disprove this. And I got very, very anxious about it. And I went to my wife and I said, just tell me I'm really here. Just tell me that I survived and I'm here, I'm alive. And she was like, of course you are, honey. You're afraid, da, da, da. And I didn't say this, in my mind, I was like, that's just the kind of thing that a hallucination would say.
After the break, we'll talk about why some experts are freaked out by near-death experiences.
There are scientists and doctors who have researched this extensively and documented thousands and thousands of cases and come to the conclusion that this is not explainable through ordinary science, and it may offer some proof of a, quote, afterlife.
I want to quickly tell you about the Next Big Idea Club's BookBox subscription. Every quarter, we get our friends Malcolm Gladwell, Adam Grant, Susan Cain, and Daniel Pink to pick the 2 best new works of nonfiction. And then we send them to our subscribers. If you sign up, you'll also get access to beautiful audio and video e-courses, invitations to exclusive AMAs with top authors, membership in our LinkedIn community, and VIP access to our live events. Plus, you'll be helping us continue to make this show. So if this is at all interesting to you, go to nextbigideaclub.com, learn more, And if you do end up subscribing, use the promo code PODCAST at checkout to get 20% off. That's nextbigideaclub.com, promo code PODCAST. Let's talk a little bit about near-death experiences, because they are, as you observe in the book, medical paradoxes, right? I mean, the brain is an incredibly resource-intensive organ. It uses 15% of the oxygenated blood in our bodies. It uses 20% of the glucose. And yet there is this inexplicable phenomenon that just as the brain is dying, people have these incredibly vivid hallucinations. What explanations do scientists have for why that might happen?
So obviously there's two camps. I mean, there are scientists and doctors who have researched this extensively and documented thousands and thousands of cases and come to the conclusion that this is not explainable through ordinary science, and it may offer some proof of a, quote, afterlife. So there is a segment of the scientific population that believes that we have found proof of the afterlife, right? And then, of course, there's the other side, the sort of rationalists, who are like, nonsense. Like, if we give you low blood oxygen, your brain will get all wonky. And if we put you in a human centrifuge like they do with fighter pilots and subject you to 5Gs, 5 times the force of gravity, that you'll see a tunnel and light and all kinds of strange visions. And, so we can reproduce. We give you LSD, you'll hallucinate all kinds of crazy things. Like, the brain is not impervious to being affected by outside factors. So I read through all this. At first I was sort of rooting for an afterlife. Like, I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. Maybe there is something more, which, for an atheist to think that, imagine how sort of anxious I was to allow myself that thought.
Right.
Like, whoa, maybe there's a flicker of hope, because death is scary. It's even scary to atheists, right? And then I read the counter arguments and like, okay, oh, well, the rationalists got this, right? And they just listed all these things that can happen in the dying brain. And that pretty much explains everything, except for one thing. The dying see the dead, and people who aren't dying do not see the dead. The doctors in the room, the family members in the room, don't see Aunt Sally crouched in the corner. Only the dying are startled to see Aunt Sally and start talking to her. So, we know that if you give a room full of people LSD, we know for a fact that 100% of them will hallucinate. And we know why. We know how LSD affects the brain, and there's no mystery there, right? But they won't all hallucinate the same thing. And what's strange about dying is that in a considerable portion of the cases, the dying see the dead. It's the one thing about all this that I'm like, all right, I'm still an atheist, but I have to say, that fact I find hard to explain in rational terms. Does it mean there's an afterlife? Does it mean there's a God? No, I'm not going to assert that. But what I am willing to say is I do not believe in God, and I don't believe in an afterlife, but my opinions are couched in a context of doubt. I understand that I might be wrong. Before this happened to me, I was an atheist and I didn't think I was wrong. Now I'm an atheist and I allow for the possibility that I'm actually completely wrong, and that we don't have a fundamental understanding of the nature of reality, the nature of consciousness, the nature of the universe. A correct understanding might allow for some post-death existence at the sort of subatomic, like quantum level, and we just are not capable of understanding it and may never will be.
Yeah, it is this startling mystery. I mean, I think you say in the book, 1/4 of all near-death survivors see the dead. And you write, quote, in mud huts and in hospital rooms, in car accidents and on battlefields, in darkened bedrooms and in screaming ambulances, deathly ill people are startled to see loved ones hovering over them. And I think we actually all kind of know this. A lot of us know this from personal experience, right? Like, I mean, my grandfather died a few years ago, and on his last day in the hospital, he was visited or had visions of his brother who was long dead and his parents. And it was actually sort of weirdly joyous. He was glad to see them. He was comforted by their presence.
Yeah, and one of the really mysterious things is that sometimes the dead person who shows up is someone who died recently, and that the dying person didn't know about that.
Crazy.
Just crazy, right? I mean, and again, I as a journalist, I refrain from asserting things that I can't prove. But what I'll say is that I divided my book into two sections: what and if. What deals with what happened to me.
Yeah.
If is basically, what if there were something more? How would that work? Like as a thought experiment in rational scientific terms, how would some kind of post-death existence work? How could we explain it? And that's where I get into quantum physics. And I didn't pioneer that. There's a lot of very smart people who have mucked around in this stuff, and I tried to distill their thoughts and their findings into something that was understandable and sort of accessible to people.
And the if section, I have to say, is almost as startling and harrowing as the what section, because it's mind-bending and trippy and scary and confusing. And my read on that part of the book is that you mentioned earlier, your dad was a physicist. He was a literal-minded guy. He was a rationalist. And he is who visited you. He is the vision you had in that what was nearly your final moment. And I read that section of the book as you maybe trying to pick up some of the tools of his trade to understand what he would have made of that experience you had, how he would have tried to explain or contextualize or rationalize that bizarre and inexplicable moment. Does that resonate?
Yeah, I mean, as I did my research, I realized that there were some possible explanations or theories or at least thought experiments in the realm of quantum physics, and which was, sort of adjacent to my father's specialty in physics. So I started circling back into basically what was his world. And I called up two colleagues of his, but I told them what happened. I said, I would like to talk with you guys about what you think my father would make of this. If I could somehow tell my father that he had appeared as I was dying, like, what would my atheist rationalist father make of such a thing?
Yeah.
So that, we had an interesting conversation, but at one point I said, so what are the odds of that happening, of my father rematerializing over me, basically on my deathbed? Like, what are the odds? And it was a sort of rhetorical question. Like, how do you even calculate that, right? Except, never underestimate the eggheads, right? The nerds, the scientists, the smart people, right? Like and one of them, Rudolph, sort of cocked his head up, sort of looking up and sort of running some numbers in his head. I was like, what am I watching? Is he actually calculating the odds? Are you kidding? Is this doable? And he said, I'd say it was about 10 to the minus 60. I was like, what? And he said, look, it's roughly the same odds. And he was referring to statistical mechanics pioneered by an Austrian physicist named Boltzmann in the late 1800s. He said, what are the odds of all of the oxygen molecules in this room just randomly convening in one corner of the room and suffocating us to death because all of the oxygen is in one corner? What are the odds of that? And we know what those are because of statistical mechanics. It's roughly 10 to the minus 60. So the odds of the atoms and the molecules that once made up your father, or the quantum information that underlies those, reappearing, reassembling in the corner of the room is probably on the same order of magnitude of unlikely. So that means it's one chance in a number that has 60 zeros after it. That's what that refers to, in case people are intimidated by that notation. It's just one chance in a number that has basically 60 zeros after it. In other words, almost infinitely unlikely.
But not dismissible.
Yeah, so one way to think about the existence of the universe is that in an infinity of time, all things eventually must happen, including the creation of a universe. And our universe went from 0 to hundreds of millions of light years across in an amount of time that is too small to measure. Think about that.
You have mentioned now a few times quantum mechanics, quantum physics. And I once heard you say that you were like a terrible science student in school. You barely passed your high school science classes. And that actually served you well as a journalist, because if you could understand a scientific concept well enough to be able to write about it, then anyone would be able to read what you wrote and get it. So using that skill, give me sort of an explanation of quantum mechanics, quantum physics that even I, a fellow near flunker of science classes, could understand.
I can explain what I go into the book, which are the apparent contradictions at the quantum level that so freaked out the first physicists, including Einstein, that were involved in their discovery, because they make no sense in the macroscopic world that we all live in. And so basically, if you're watching a pendulum, the pendulum doesn't jump from position to position. It's a continuous swing. In the macroscopic world, it's a continuous swing from one end of the arc to the other. But in the subatomic world, where electrons are circling the nuclei of atoms, it's not continuous. The electron is at any given moment in a discrete location and then moves to the next location without transiting the space in between them. So Heisenberg's uncertainty principle is that you can know the speed and direction of the electron, or you can know its location, but you can't know both at the same time. And as soon as you pin one factor down, okay, the electron's right here, you lose information about its movement. And once you understand its movement, you lose information about its direction. And so what that meant for Heisenberg was that observation created the reality that you're looking at. That once you observe something, it's forced to go from a spectrum of all possible things into one specific thing. And Schrodinger's cat is sort of the famous example of this. So Schrodinger's cat is basically this. You put a cat in a box. I don't know why they picked a cat. You put a cat in a box, and there's a mechanism inside the box that an hour later, there's exactly a 50% chance of releasing a deadly poison that will kill the cat instantaneously. And it's exactly a 50% chance. And so then you let that happen, but you haven't opened the box yet. And so what Schrodinger says is that in quantum terms, the cat is both alive and dead simultaneously until you open the lid and observe it. And then when you do that, you find out that it's either indeed alive or dead, and the chances of that are exactly 50-50, so there's no way of sort of guessing. And your observation actually collapsed what's called the wave function of the cat into one particular thing, a live cat or a dead cat. And so that it's been suggested that the entire universe is one massive wave function, and the arrival of conscious thought in the universe collapsed the universe into one particular thing, the universe that we're observing, because like the cat, it had to sort of pick one state to be in. And what they found at the quantum level, and I'll end with this, but it's one of the greatest enigmas of science, I think. If you have a steel plate that photons, that light cannot pass through, and you have two slits in the plate, and photographic film on the other side, a strike plate on the other side that will record where the photons hit. If you fire photons at the plate and you do not observe it while you're doing this, a single photon, will go through both slits at the same time. I mean, you can't walk through two doorways at the same time. It's impossible. But a photon, as long as you don't observe it, will go through both slits at the same time and hit the strike plate on the far side in that particular pattern. If you observe it, that same photon has to pick one slit. It can't observed do something impossible. And so it picks one slit. And that's the central enigma of quantum physics that completely freaked out the scientists that discovered it 100 or so years ago. And it's at the heart of the question, do we really understand what we're looking at when we look at reality? Is our reality actually created by our own observation? And it sort of an extension of that theory is that maybe consciousness is part of the physical makeup of the universe, the way gravity is, right? Like gravity is this force. It's invisible. It binds all things. The universe wouldn't exist without it. Well, maybe consciousness is the same way. And without consciousness, the physical universe would not exist in the form that we know it to.
And so connect all this back then to the vision you had of your father. Is it that he's a wave function and somehow you were able to sort of, I don't know, disrupt the quantum? I don't even have the language for it. But connect it back to that moment and maybe how it provides an explanation for something stranger and deeper than just a hallucination.
Yeah, and no one has the language for it, right? I mean, it's been suggested this is just simply beyond the scope of human understanding. Mm-hmm. But the sort of conversations around this are that quantum information can't be lost, and that among other things, a human life is an assemblage of an awful lot of quantum information, and that when you die, that quantum information goes somewhere, and there may be a kind of universal consciousness that if there's a consciousness that suffuses the entire physical universe, which is 93 billion light years across, but consciousness suffuses the entire thing and is part of the physical nature of the universe, and that when you die, your individual consciousness sort of returns to that colossus consciousness. So there's some conversations around those ideas. But again, we're trying to understand that with the tool of our human brain, which is amazing, but not unlimited in its potential. And as I say in the book, we might understand reality in the same way that a dog understands a television screen, right? Like it's looking at the actors on the TV series or whatever, thinking that that's actually really happening and not seeing the wider context around it. So reality for us might be the TV screen. The broader reality that created that TV screen, we are incapable of understanding, just like a dog can't understand how the wider reality creates the TV screen for it.
Yeah. My dog loves to watch 101 Dalmatians. Seriously. I'm not kidding.
I bet. Yeah, right. 101 new friends.
But okay, so you're making a really great point here that this is probably beyond the scope of human intelligence, human comprehension. So you're already in a strange, anxious state. It must have been kind of overwhelming for you to try to start peeling back the layers here and unpack some of this information. I mean, was it overwhelming, disturbing? Like, what was it evoking?
Well, the physics section, which is quite brief and maybe 10 pages. I don't want people to be scared off by the word physics, right? But I mean, if I can understand it, anyone can understand it, right? I mean, the one thing I'm not is a science nerd, but I did read an enormous amount of physics over the course of like 2 or 3 weeks, and then try to write about it. And I have to say, I started to feel a little crazy. Like I like what's happening to my brain? Like I mean, it's hard. It was hard to explain, but it was not a stable feeling, and I started to question everything, which isn't a great feeling, right? Like because physics questions reality, right? Like what is what is consciousness? And so if you really understand the scientific reasons for questioning what we take to be self-evident, it can make you kind of sort of like dizzy almost.
Sure.
And that's what started to happen to me. And my wife and children were away for a long weekend, and I was just like marinating in physics. And by the time they came back, like Monday night, I was like, "Oh, thank God you're back!" Like, because I was headed out into the, like atmosphere, like the outer space here. It was a very, very strange experience.
The point you've gotten across incredibly well and get across beautifully in the book is that despite what we do know about the way the world works, it is still fundamentally mysterious. We live in a world that was created by unknowable forces that violates its own basic laws. We can't rule anything out. We can't say with absolute certainty that consciousness isn't immortal. Do you find that ultimately to be frightening or inspiring?
At one point, someone said, when you couldn't explain what happened in rational terms, why didn't you turn to mysticism? Mm-hmm. And I said, because that's what an explanation is rational terms. Mm-hmm. That's what one is. And if you explain something through mysticism, it's actually not an explanation, it's a story.
Yeah.
And people use stories to comfort themselves about things that actually don't have an explanation. And I just choose not to use the God story or the afterlife story. That said, the idea that there is a kind of universal consciousness that we are an expression of in our extremely limited individual form, which was an idea that Schrödinger held, that Einstein played with, and that my father actually sort of adhered to.
Mm-hmm.
And the idea that when you die, you're actually not ceasing, you're being reunited.
Mm.
And not in a way where your individual consciousness is necessarily retained. Like, oh, here I am, Sebastian Junger, in the afterlife with my feet propped up on a pillow. Like that, like not in that form.
Right.
But
you're like a wave returning to the ocean, yeah?
Right. I mean, in the way that gravity is a part of, is sort of nowhere and everywhere, maybe consciousness is nowhere and everywhere in exactly the same kind of way, and that you return to that. I found that kind of comforting.
Mm.
What didn't seem appealing was eternal consciousness, which is what people usually mean by an afterlife. Like, I retain my individual identity, my name's Sebastian, and now I just get to be conscious for the rest of it, forever, right? Like, oh, I died, that was maybe an uncomfortable transition, and now boom, here I am in the afterlife, everything's good, and presumably you don't need to eat, you don't have pain, you don't, there's no gravity, you just sort of float around. Like, it's a very childlike vision of existence. But in my mind, I'm like, whoa, wait a minute, watch out. Like, I could barely get through math class in high school. 50 minutes was a friggin' eternity. Are you sure you want to be conscious for eternity with no possible exit?
It's like being stuck on a transatlantic flight that never ends. No snacks, no in-flight entertainment.
Exactly. And you don't know who you're going to be sitting next to either, right? Like, who's in the middle? Who's in the middle of the seat? Or maybe you're in the middle of the seat, right? Like, we just don't know. The idea of just sort of eternal consciousness, like, be careful. And you don't even know the quote afterlife could involve a huge amount of pain. You really want that to go on? The one thing that being alive, the one thing about it is that if the pain is unbearable, you can pull the plug, right? And that you really may not want to be in a situation where that's not an option. And also, because of the second law of thermodynamics and entropy, the universe itself is finite.
Right.
It will eventually experience heat death, where there's no electromagnetic force, there's no light, there's no energy, there's no movement, and the universe is basically at virtually 0 Kelvin, and essentially there's no existence. And so what you're asking for is to continue existing as your soul in a universe that no longer exists. Like, then that's not a realistic request of God, right? Like, that's just like, if he doesn't, if he quote, he doesn't have the universe survive, your little soul doesn't stand a chance. Sorry, bro. Like, that's not happening.
It's been almost 4 years now since your near-death experience. How often do you think about it at this point?
Well, I would say, if a good friend or my wife had died 4 years ago, I would be thinking about it off and on, probably every day. It would pass through my mind. It would be the new context of my life. Like, in the sort of background software in my brain, it would be there pretty constantly, but less and less the focus of my attention.
Yeah.
And less a matter of painful emotionality. And so what was extremely painful for me, emotionally painful, after the event, after I almost died, I would say almost unbearably painful. It's now just a weird fact about me. Right? Like, wow, that time I almost died. Wow, crazy. Like, sometimes people ask me, like, do you live differently now because of that?
Yeah.
I've given that a lot of thought. Sort of yes and no. If you were sort of observing me with a CCTV camera all day long, I don't think my life would look like it's different. I'm not sitting in the lotus position or anything. Like, but what I would say is that internally it is a little bit different. And I'll sort of illustrate with an anecdote from the great Russian writer Dostoevsky. So Dostoevsky, when he was a young man, wanted to be a writer. He was sort of a political agitator, and he was sort of like, he openly discussed liberating the serfs. So this is in the 1840s in Russia, right? Tsarist Russia.
Yeah.
Liberating the serfs, much like the conversation in the United States about liberating the slaves, right? It was sort of similar conversation around a similar era. And he and his buddies who enjoy talking about such things were promptly, like, arrested and thrown in prison for 8 months by the Tsar's police. So then after about 8 months, they were sort of rounded up and loaded into a carriage, and they fully expected to be released, right? It wasn't a serious crime. It was just a slap on the wrist. But instead of being released, they were driven to a town square and tied to posts, and a firing squad was arranged before them. And so these poor young men only had a couple of minutes to adjust to the idea that they were about to die, right? In a couple of minutes, they would be dead, right? Dostoevsky was contemplating this, and he saw some sunlight glinting on a roof. And he thought, in moments, I'm going to be part of the sunlight. I'm going to be part of everything. And if somehow I should be granted the chance to live, I will make every individual moment an eternity. I will appreciate everything. And you can't live like that, right? I mean, it's a psychotic way to live. You can't live constantly like that. But if you can attain that level, that sort of dead man walking appreciation of reality and life and the earth, even for a few moments a day, you will change your perspective on everything. And so that's what I try to do. And frankly, it calms me down when I'm in a traffic jam or when my kids are stressing me out or whatever, just those normal human things. If you sort of return to the sunlight glinting on the roof, like, oh, I'm part of all things and every moment is its own miracle. It is a kind of Zen practice that actually gets you to see life and experience life a little bit differently.
You're a dad. You have 2 daughters. The fact that your dad visited you or was there, or whatever terms we want to use in that nearly final moment, how, if at all, has that changed your relationship with your kids? How has that changed you as a parent?
Well, parents will know the feeling that you want to be able to provide everything your children vitally need to grow up to be strong, healthy, unanxious people. Like, you want to be able to provide all those things, and you want to be able to protect them from everything that would terrify them or harm them or undermine their basic human dignity. You want to be able to do all that. And the problem for a parent, the problem with dying, I mean, there's a lot of problems with it, but one of the problems with dying is that you're no longer there to be a parent for your children and they need you. And I'm an older dad. I mean, I didn't have children. My first daughter was born when I was 55. I'm not going to be a grandfather, right? Probably, right? I mean, if I make it to their college graduation, I'll be doing good, right? And that's a very painful thing, mostly, I think, because I'm worried that they'll need me, right? I'll miss out, but also they might need me. What am I going to do? What are they going to do? And of course, they'll figure something out. But the idea that, my father was on the spectrum, and emotionally, he was a pretty removed father and pretty frustrating, particularly for my sister and also for me. And when he circled back, even if he was just a hallucination, right, which is entirely possible, but when he, in quotes, circled back to give me comfort in this worst possible moment of my life, I experienced it as an incredible act of love and devotion and paternal care. And the idea that that might be possible in a universe that we just don't understand is enormously consoling and inspiring. That in some way, even after I die, that in ways we just don't understand, and I'm not calling on God here, I'm really not, that we don't understand the science of this, that I might somehow provide a comfort during my daughter's worst moments is, there's a kind of salvation in that. And there's a huge comfort for me as a father.
The book is In My Time of Dying, How I Came Face to Face with the Idea of an Afterlife. Sebastian, it's been an honor and a treat to talk with you today. Thanks so much.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Well, in my time of dying, don't want nobody to mourn. All I want for you to do is take my body home. Well, so I can die easy. Well, so I can die.
Sebastian Junger survived, in part, because he received 10 units of blood to replace what he'd lost. In other words, he writes in an afterword, 10 anonymous blood donors helped save my life. In gratitude, I now donate blood as often as I'm allowed roughly 3 or 4 times a year. I must confess, a little shamefacedly, that I have never donated blood. But that ends now. I found a local blood drive, I've added it to my calendar, and I would encourage you to do the same if you're able. As Sebastian writes, there aren't many ways to be part of something greater than yourself, and donating blood is one of the easiest and finest. You can find a nearby donation center by visiting www.donatingblood.org. And here's the deal. If you're inspired by this episode to give blood, shoot me an email. I'm at podcast@nextbigideaclub.com, and I will send you a copy of Sebastian's new book as a thank you. Today's episode was written, cut, and hosted by me, Caleb Bissinger. Sound design by Mike Toda. Our executive producer is Rufus Griscom. Special thanks to Kat Boyd for making this interview happen. The Next Big Idea is a proud member of the LinkedIn Podcast Network. See you next week.